Hello, and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our business line leader and global director here at Intertek for our medical and laboratory business. And today I am joined by one of my colleagues, Bhavesh. Bhavesh, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, so happy to have you here today. So Bhavesh, maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you've gotten into the medical industry and kind of what your area of specialty is.
Sure. My name is Bhavesh Sheth, and I'm a part of Intertek's assurance team that primarily focuses on medical device consulting. And my background is in biomedical engineering. So I started, my undergrad, my grad studies are all in biomedical engineering and with focus on instrumentation. So really, I started as an R&D engineer, doing some verification validation as well. So it's tricky because I started as a sort of a medical device developer in a way, and then ended up looking into FDA regulations for product development. And then I got into the regulatory field with Intertek. When I joined Intertek in 2009, I joined as a FDA-accredited third-party reviewer. So, my start itself in the regulatory field was under FDA's umbrella. So, Intertek, we had a third-party review program accredited by FDA. So I was part of that program for 3 years, up until 2012, which is when Intertek transitioned into consulting. So we had to pick one over the other, and our client base needed more help. So we got into consulting, and so ever since I've joined Intertek, I've been in the regulatory field, and over the past 13 plus years, I have constantly been doing regulatory submissions, either reviewing regulatory submissions, preparing submissions, guiding our clients to prepare their files. But that's been one constant in my work profile over the years. And of course, I do a lot of other things for medical device development. So that's how I got into the regulatory field.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the most interesting things, right, as you mentioned, is coming from a engineering background, working in the R&D field, working in development, and then moving forward, right, as a manufacturer dealing with the regulatory space, and then moving on to the third-party side. As you mentioned, right, Intertek, we used to be a part of that third-party review program with the FDA. And, we've really found that working on the opposite side, helping manufacturers more, guiding them, working from a consulting aspect, because 510Ks and FDA submissions can be really challenging, right? So it has been a switch that has worked out, I think, for both sides of business, right? Working with our manufacturers and helping them in that way. So, I think it's really interesting when we talk about FDA submissions and especially about 510Ks, right? Obviously, they're some of the most common submissions. We see them a lot. Many of our manufacturers are going through the process, going through the 510K, working with the FDA. So why are 510Ks so difficult when they are just such a common thing, right? Why do they cause such headache and such grief for manufacturers?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because 510Ks, if you look at the regulatory submission pathways available to get your device, get an FDA blessings from FDA to market the device in US. Except for exempt devices, you have to do a regulatory submission for a medical device in US. So 510Ks are the easiest ones out of all of the submissions. Easiest comparatively, of course. Yeah. They are popular, but like you said, they are so popular that you would think that there would be a lot of most of the medical device manufacturers would be very aware of all the intricate details of a 510K submission. But yet it has become challenging, and it continues to become more challenging. There's a big reason behind that. So the whole 510K paradigm is based on comparison of the subject device, of the new device that a manufacturer wishes to introduce into the US market against a legally marketed device in the US in the same classification. So it's not enough to prove that your device is safe and effective. You have to now look at one of the predicate devices and show how your device, the new device, is at least as safe and as effective as a predicate.
Yeah.
So you're constantly under that, limitation that you have to keep the comparison aspect in mind, which is beneficial in a way, but also can, obviously put more constraints on the manufacturers because now they have to find details about the predicate device. The other big reason why 510Ks can be confusing sometimes is because when there is a perception that you have to compare your device to the predicate device, for applicants who are doing this for the first time, or non-medical device manufacturers getting into the medical domain for the first time, may be under the impression that if the devices are, let's say, 90% matching, they actually don't need to do the testing.
Yeah.
Which is not true, because you still have to do your own due diligence for your product. It's just that you have to do it in context of comparison with the predicate device. So that's one of the big reasons why the initial planning may be like, okay, we have a device in our hand, we have good enough documentation, and we should be able to launch the device in the market fairly soon. But the whole calculation goes awry because the time for testing isn't taken into account. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen a whole lot, but there are some manufacturers you would find under that particular situation. So, and lastly, I would say because 510K submission, if you look at the 510K submission guidance, the regular guidance, 20 sections, it's pretty straightforward. But the challenging aspect is that you don't find everything written in that one guidance. There's so many other guidances. Almost every topic, every section has its own dedicated guidance. Talk about sterility, biocompatibility, software, human factors. So there's a lot of reading for first-timers or, as I mentioned, companies doing medical devices for the first time. And the biggest one, I would say, is compliance with quality management system. Mm-hmm. ISO 13485, complying with FDA's quality system regulations. So,
yeah, and you mentioned a couple of things that I want to kind of touch on a little bit here, right? So you talk about the identification of a predicate, right? You need to understand what devices are out there that are equivalent to what you're trying to put on the market, as well as exemptions. So as a manufacturer, if I'm trying to determine these things, right, if I'm trying to determine a predicate device, or if I'm trying to determine, as you mentioned, right, all medical devices have to go through this process unless they're exempt. How do I determine those things as a manufacturer, as someone who may be, first time bringing a medical device to market through the FDA?
Yeah, I would say make the FDA website, their database is, your friend. Get friendly with them. Spend a lot of time on the database because it can be very intimidating when you get into the FDA website and you look in the medical device sections. You're going to find more links over and over, mm-hmm. going more in depth in each topic. And there are dedicated database for 510K, for de novo, for PMA, other kinds of submission, as well as product classification. So I think I would say a lot of this boils down to planning. So if, the ideal way would be that once there is a concept in mind that we're going to make this kind of device, I think the search should begin there. Whether that device is classified by FDA under a product code, like the 3-letter product code that FDA has. And if it is determined that, yes, it is classified under FDA regulations and has a dedicated product code, things become easier because now you get your classification details going to that page and you basically understand whether 510K is required or not. That page tells you whether the device actually needs a 510K or whether it is 510K exempt. So now let's assume it needs a 510K submission. Well, then the manufacturer, the applicant, has the product code, and now their next step should be to go into the 510K database and look for predicate devices. Mm-hmm. So, if at least these few steps are completed initially, even before getting into the whole preparation of documents, things become much more easier because once you read the details, available details of the predicate device through a summary document like a 510k summary, tells you a lot. And it used to be a case where FDA was pretty relaxed, I want to say about 10 years back, 15 years back, where they wouldn't be asking too many details. And even 510k summaries from those, that time frame, you wouldn't find that many details about the predicate device. But now,
yeah. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it is an interesting thing to know, right? Just being in the industry for a long time. You've been in the industry for quite a long time. I've been in the industry for many years, right? And I think we've seen a shift in the FDA and their scrutiny on some things, right? Of course, we've seen that change, that things have become more stringent in some cases, but then we've also seen, their willingness to work more with manufacturers, work together early, have discussions about new types of technology and new types of devices. So, I mean, what are you seeing? What can you attribute that to, just this kind of shift in the overall maybe mindset of the FDA or how they're participating with manufacturers in the way that they're reviewing and viewing submissions?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of factors are responsible for that, because FDA's shift, or I should say FDA's increase in scrutiny for 510k submissions and their need for more information constantly keeps a burden on manufacturers, because you could be in a situation where there's a device cleared last year and you used it as a predicate device. And then this year, FDA may be asking you something new, additional. So, and there could be a big reason behind that. FDA's prime focus is safety and effectiveness of the device. So, they, of course, are going to try and make sure, patient safety, public safety is paramount. But what they do is, on the other side, is they've increased this collaboration with the applicants or applicants preparing prospective regulatory submissions. So they have opened up avenues. They were always there, like a pre-submission or a Q-submission, but now they have made it more streamlined, where they give an opportunity to manufacturers to get in touch with them upfront and get confidence in what they're trying to do. Are they on the right path? Sometimes it could be that the device being developed, so you can't find a predicate device for it. So what, it's a novel device? Well, how do I go about choosing the regulatory pathway? So there is a specific approach for that, a 513G request for inquiry or request for information inquiry. So you choose that, you give information to the FDA, you get a formal written feedback saying, okay, yes, it's a medical device. The predicate devices you weren't able to find, but sometimes FDA can tell you that, in fact, this should be a classification, and then you can review the predicate devices. Or they could tell you, well, the product isn't fit for a 510K. You got to start thinking about de novo. So I think that's been the prime focus. Now, a lot of times this comes down to the deadlines. Of course, once the device is made, every manufacturer wants to go into the market right away, and understandably so. So not everybody is going to get into this dialogue with FDA upfront, and not everybody needs to. If there's a device for which you have a predicate with very little differences and you know what type of testing you need to do, and it's fairly simple, then there is no need for a pre-submission. However, if there are differences, significant differences, or cases in which there are performance tests based on methods that are not from a recognized standard, I think it makes sense to do a pre-submission, because you can explain FDA your method of testing up front and get their blessings. So
yeah, and I think it's such a good point too, because we've seen, right, how quickly medical device technology is evolving. So to your point, someone could get a device onto the market, have their device cleared a year ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and now things have changed. So either, the interpretation might be different, or technology is advancing, or the ways that we interpret technology is advancing, and the FDA now may have more questions or be asking for different things because they're learning, right, all at the same time that we are, as we see this medical technology just rapidly evolving.
Right.
Yeah.
And the recognized standards may have new versions.
Right. Which we're seeing.
That's always there. Yeah. That's always there as well.
Yeah.
And so it's constantly evolving situation. I mean, I can totally understand the situation the manufacturers find themselves in, because they could be doing a 510k today and doing the next one 3 years down the line. Yeah. I do it every week, every month, and I still get surprised by some of the things FDA asks for, or FDA starts looking into. So,
well, that's interesting. So what are some of the most common things that you're seeing? Obviously, you mentioned, right, we have lots of different types of submissions that we see, but 510Ks are the most common. So in these 510K submissions, what are common pitfalls or areas of concern or challenges or things that we're seeing? As you mentioned, you're in this every single day with different types of devices, different types of manufacturers. What do we see when we're looking at, putting together these submissions and some of the common pitfalls and areas of concern?
Well, I would say to begin with, it's not so much about classification. I think more or less any manufacturer who decides to go into a 510K with some kind of regulatory help through consultants or their in-house expertise, I think more or less figure out the classification. And selection of predicate device is one area that could be challenging. Earlier, FDA used to allow comparison with multiple predicates, or like a piecemeal approach. You take 25% of this predicate, 25% of that predicate, choose 3 or 4 predicates, and then you basically have functionalities to compare from 4 different devices. But the FDA has moved away from that. Okay. They are very specific in that they want only one device called out as a predicate to base the argument of substantial equivalence. However, they allow applicants to cite other products as reference devices. Okay. So, a very simple example of this is a device may have the same functions as a predicate device, but the subject device maybe has wireless capability, some sort of wireless functionality, which is not too complicated, and the predicate device doesn't have it.
I see.
Although 90% of the characteristics do match. However, another device in that classification may be matching less to the subject device, let's say 50%, but that device has wireless functionality. And you can leverage the clearance of such device with wireless functionality. So that's one example of trying to find a balance between selection of a predicate device and use of other devices as a reference device.
Well, and that might come into play too, right? With systems, right? Because now we see a lot of medical systems, not just single devices, right? You're seeing connectivity between multiple devices in a single system. So that obviously would make sense in some of those instances as well.
Yeah. Vital signs monitor. You have peripheral devices, you have apps, so you've got a lot of things to look into. And so that predicate device selection is a lot of times a big area, of concern if not done correctly. The other pitfall, the big pitfall, I guess, is risk management, as it is with a lot of issues we find under the certification and testing projects 60601 evaluation. So the standard is still ISO 14971. FDA goes by the same recognized standard as is referenced in 60601. However, there's a big difference, and we can talk a little more on this as well, of what you are presenting to the test house, to the certification folks, and what you're presenting to the FDA, and at what level are these two parties reviewing it. So that's a good distinction too, right?
What we may be asking for on a testing side versus a regulatory agency like the FDA, and what they're expecting to see from your risk analysis, risk documentation, how you put that all together, to sort of the same, but there's differences and nuances in each, right?
Yeah. And then there are specific areas like sterility, biocompatibility. I mean, although now word is getting out pretty strongly that all biocompatibility tests need to be compliant with, should be done in accordance with GLP guidelines, 21 CFR Part 58. But a applicant doing a 510k for the first time goes to a test lab and they're going to find a lower price for non-GLP testing without proper knowledge that FDA requires biocompatibility studies in compliance with GLP. They may opt for it, and that may not be enough for FDA.
Yeah.
That is not going to be enough for FDA. So those kind of things are common pitfalls.
Does that come down to those guidances too? So, right, when you're talking about the overall, 20 plus different sections, and then there's guidances for each. So if I'm a manufacturer and I know that biocompatibility is required for my device because it comes into human contact, all of those things, I can find then a guidance from the FDA that says, okay, with your 510k and doing a biocompatibility study, you need to follow good laboratory practices or work with a lab that tests with good laboratory practices.
Absolutely. And all of these guidance documents we're not talking a couple of pages. These are pretty substantial, detailed guidance, for sterility, for biocompatibility. So, it's very important to read those guidances because you have clarity on the types of methods that FDA, is normally seeing in the 510Ks. And if you know that you're doing something out of the box, well, that's your cue to get in touch with FDA up front, rather than doing the 510K and then getting questions from FDA and getting limited time to answer them. So that is another area. The last one I would say, and I'm we find it a lot, something or the other in the software sections. Well, I guess a lot of it is also comes down to how we treat, or how is the software reviewed or looked at during medical device testing and certification process. And now how is FDA requiring that to be documented? So that's another area where we've seen a lot of additional information requests from FDA.
Right, because I think one of the interesting points to kind of really hone in on is the FDA is looking for, as you mentioned, right, safety, but also effectiveness, right? So when we're doing testing to the standards on the 60601 side, right, we're looking at the safety of the device, right? We're not the judge of whether or not it is effective in the treatment that it says that it's doing or what it's claiming to do, where the FDA, of course, is so concerned not only in the safety, but also in the effectiveness in order to allow that product to be placed on the market.
Yes, and the test house, no matter who you go to, we are a pretty big test house, nationally recognized test lab, or you could go to some other lab. But scope is safety testing and certification. And the team or the person doing the test, as required by the standard, is looking at it from a technical standpoint, strictly in the confines of the standard. They are not bringing the review aspect from a clinical side. The FDA is going to have with their staff, they have all the clinical expertise they need to make, judgments on any types of devices. So there's always going to be difference in the level of scrutiny by the test house compared to what the regulatory folks are looking at.
And one thing you mentioned too, and I think it's worth noting, right, is the timeliness and the timelines that exist when you're dealing with the FDA and you're putting together these submissions. So as an example, if we take a 510K, right, you submit, you have a certain amount of time, as you said, for the FDA to respond to you and then you to respond to the FDA. Can you chat a little bit about that and how those timelines kind of work as a manufacturer once you make your submission?
Yeah, so once the file is submitted to the FDA, the 510K is submitted to the FDA, the first thing FDA does, and very diligently now, is screening. Earlier, the screening used to be, I'll just give you a quick example. Well, yes, the file has 20 sections. There is a little bit in software. There's a little bit in biocompatibility. So yes, it's best screening. This was 10, 15 years back. Now FDA's, their staff, administrative staff, is looking at it more closely and saying, okay, we see there are 20 sections in the 510K or more. And, just overview, still cursory overview. What does it contain? Does it contain enough information for that file to be sent further for a substantiative review, as in the administrative check is done, screening is done, and is it worth for our reviewers to now look at it and make a proper decision on the content that's been presented in the file? And if the answer is no, then the submission gets turned back with what they call refuse to accept checklist. What it really means is that they need more information for the file to be progressed further for substantiative review. Now, you can imagine if that, if you get that kind of a situation, then it's in the best interest for the manufacturers to respond quickly, because you don't want delays for the file to be moved forward. But let's say that doesn't happen. The file passes the screening, so you are in the 90-day review timeframe by FDA. And the best way to understand this is, well, the best case scenario is what has been presented to FDA is adequate and they're happy with it. Then they'll make a decision at the end of 90 days, and manufacturers will have their clearance letter, 510k clearance letter. That's the best case scenario. However, if FDA has questions, and if they are minor questions, then FDA has started doing informal communications. Mm-hmm. So the reviewer might get in touch with the applicant and say, okay, hey, I see something in your document here, which is pretty minor, for which we're not going to put the submission on a formal hold. But if you can send me this corrected file or corrected document in a few days, then we'll keep continuing our review. Yeah. So that kind of informal back and forth is now possible, and FDA uses it at their discretion. However, if there are many deficiencies, then you pretty much end up getting a request for additional information. We call it RAI letter. Mm-hmm. And once that letter comes through, the applicants automatically get 180 days to respond. That might seem like a lot, but and for tests like electrical safety and other tests, most of the tests can be done in that time frame. But the point is, why would a manufacturer and applicant want to subject themselves to that kind of a deadline, right? Of course, if it's unavoidable, it's unavoidable. FDA maybe found some incidents last year, which is why now they're asking additional information. So yeah, fair enough. Then you can't do anything about it. You just give them the additional information they're looking for. But there is this. It's beneficial to have those 180 days to be able to respond. And let's say if the response is not complete or is not to FDA's liking in that 180-day time frame, then there is an option for the applicant to voluntarily withdraw the submission. Mm-hmm. Or FDA will basically give not substantial equivalent judgment. So that's pretty much the end of that particular file. Now, I think a lot of clients I've worked with, obviously, if they cannot complete the required testing in the time frame, or they just thought of modifying the device mm-hmm. midway through the submission review, and whatever didn't work out for the business plans, may have chosen to voluntarily withdraw rather than risking getting a rejection from it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because even with, some of the manufacturers that we work with and things that we see, the FDA is coming back asking for all sorts of things, right? It could be additional information on cybersecurity data, right? Especially now with everything that we're seeing a lot of that. Or maybe they want, to your point, additional electrical safety or performance data or usability studies, whatever it might be. So those 180 days, it may seem like a lot of time, yeah. Depending on what they're asking for, you can burn through those days pretty quickly if you're having to provide a lot of additional information or run a lot of additional testing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think a lot of times that perception is also wrong that, okay, the testing can be done in 2 months. But what about the queue time? Yeah. How quickly is the lab going to start the project, right? And you'd have to factor in some time for back and forth, like mm-hmm. we see with 60601 projects. Sometimes it's a component for which approvals are needed and the clients need more time to find that, or they are revising their documents. So a lot of things can happen. So I think obviously the preferred approach is to have all testing completed and to the as best as possible before doing the 510k.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up here, I would love to just hear, of course, you've been in this industry a long time, working with so many different types of manufacturers, gone through this process many, many times. So any tips, tricks, suggestions? I mean, you've given a lot of really useful information if someone is trying to go down this path, but anything else you want to leave our viewers with here?
I think planning is the most important. I mean, it might seem like, cliche term to talk about, but everything needs planning. But I think why it's important is because if you plan properly, as I mentioned, starting with the device type that you want to go with, the classification, and let's say 3 or 4 devices that you will eventually compare to. So your limitations. What kind of features those devices have and how you develop your device. And at the same time, reviewing those other devices give you an idea of what FDA is looking for. Sometimes you find summary documents, the 510k summary documents, detailed so much that all the tests that are needed with the numbers and versions and everything. So that's your list. That's the testing you need.
Yeah, point you in the right direction pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that actually is saving you a lot of time, to actually dive into those individual guidance documents, which is still recommended. But a lot of times you get that kind of information based on the predicates 510k summary. But I think the other aspect here is, while all that is happening, while the device is being developed, risk management is often left out as an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we got everything, our device works, we tested the software, it works, everything's great. Now we need to comply with ISO 14971. We have the SOP, but we haven't created an FMEA. Let's start. That's too late. You don't want to be starting your risk management close to the device being finalized. There are steps in ISO 14971 recommended methods. They are there for a reason. Preliminary hazard analysis, progressing through a formal hazard analysis matrix to a document that you are eventually going to submit to a test house or regulatory body. And I think that risk management activity, if done properly, helps a lot to get the right testing done in a timely manner.
Yeah. Can't stress enough how important that piece of it is. Well, I think the other thing too that I love that you said, and I think is so important to know, right, is to make the FDA's website your best friend, right? Really get on there.
Absolutely. I mean, FDA has a lot of training, learning material about medical device in general, how they are regulated, and what kind of requirements at a high level are applicable to medical devices in general. But their website is updated, regularly. So, and database, I think their database are very important to look at. They have recognized standards database. They have this 510k and other submission databases. They also have database for establishment, registration, and listing. A lot of times I've found manufacturers not being able to decide whether their device actually needs a 510k or not, or they are confused between 2 classification codes. And a lot of times, one of those classification codes may be 510k exempt, like the other one requires 510k. So now what do? Well, you could try research a bit and find out from the registration database, what's a competitor's device listed as? Under what classification? Exempt, not exempt? That gives you some insight into what you may be required to do, because now you have a precedent to look at.
Yeah. Well, this was such a great conversation. I could just talk about this all day. Super great intel that you shared with us. So really appreciate that. If anyone has questions, they can reach out to us, and I will make sure to get you connected with Bhavesh. He knows all the things about the FDA and 510k process and has done this for quite a long time. So I'll make sure to get you connected. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Bhavesh, so much for all of the great information that you shared. And we will talk to everybody next time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. Thanks.
Have a good one.
You too.